The story of an Iraqi village torn apart by Islamic State, a town now liberated but still living with the families of their enemies. Scars run deep in this part of the world, but the war on terror isn't always fought with guns and bombs. Sometimes a little kindness can be the ultimate weapon. In Shora, an experiment in reconciliation. Welcome to this special edition of Plugged In. I'm Mil Arcega, filling in for Greta Van Susteren. So what happens when the family of your enemy lives next door? And what if that enemy is the most brutal terrorist organization in the world? What would you do? Would you plot revenge or drive them away? Well, those are all relevant questions for a small Iraqi town called Shoura, not far from the former Islamic State stronghold of Mosul. Now, in a powerful new documentary, VOA Middle East correspondent Heather Murdoch chronicles the efforts of the people of Shoura, who are doing what many thought was unthinkable.
This is the story of a town deep in the Iraqi desert, a story of violence, vengeance, and the seemingly impossible task of reconciliation. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, provoking an insurgency. Over the next decade, the most extreme fighters evolved into the Islamic State group. IS forces took over large parts of Iraq and Syria. Their leader declared a caliphate. This town was home to several leading militants, and roughly half the men here swore allegiance to the group. Their will was imposed on all. In 2016, a counteroffensive began pushing IS out. Now in this town, the families of the defeated militants live side by side with the families of the victims. This town is Shora.
بهاي السنين طبقوا داعش ضاع مستقبلنا ضاعت الدراسة كل شيء راحت دراستنا مستقبلنا كان السعانة نجح في الكلية أنا ضال كان السعانة أول مرحلة أولى
بطلنا المدرسة بطلنا ما عشان مسوي قاعدين بالبيت وساكتين
بس بعدين واكم مدارس صارت كلها كلاوات عشان نقول يعني تدريسهم ما معترف به صارت يعني تلبس زي واحد لازم اللي هو عندها ريم يجي انت الطالب ابتدائي مو واحد زائد واحد طلقه زائد طلقه ما اعرف شنو يعلمون على السوالف هاي يعني تشتري ما اعرف شنو هاي هي المدارس عاد انه ما حد قام يودي الطلاب على المدارس.
When IS took over, many people believed it could end years of oppression and instability and begin an era of pious, efficient governance. Before Islamic State, tribal leaders were the region's moral authority, but militants stripped them of their power and some fled. In Shora, we meet a sheikh who stayed. A traditional leader by lineage, he became the area's leading sheikh after IS was defeated.
الجمهور أحمد الملا منصور الشيخ عشيرة العميرة قبيلة جبر من 2003 إلى 2013 14 هم كانوا تجمعات ومشيتهم على أساس الناس أهل دين.
The sheikh tells us that new recruits, more than 700 of Shora's men and boys, were told they were joining an Islamic revolution.
فهم بعدين قاموا يقتلون الشرطة قبل اقتلوا الشرطة واقتلوا نساء اقتلوا ناس مدنيين اقتلوا ناس عندهم مال اللي يطيحهم يقتلون ويدزون الناس عليهم ولا الثمين بالليل يقتل.
People who joined IS could be killed if they tried to quit. Death was a risk just living under militants' rule. Not far from Shora is this sinkhole, where militants tossed out the bodies of their victims from across the region. Here alone are thought to be the remains of more than 10,000 people. To boost recruitment, militants had children attend screenings at Shora's media center. They watched videos of IS military victories, whippings, beheadings, and other acts of brutality. And the violence was not just on screen.
صارت حالة انه بقطع راس واحدة من هيك غير مكان جوا الساحة مال كرة قدم قطعوا راسه هم تهمة انه عميل عند القوات الامنية. يا خلنا هذا ديب هالمكان جمعوا العالم سووا حلقة اختارهم يعني دواعي جابوه هنا ومرة قاموا يضربون بيه ما اعرف شنو قدام العالم خلوا العالم عايد دواعش تتفل عليهم من ذبحوه قاموا يلعبون برأسه ما اعرف شنو بهاي المنطقة صارت توقف هناك.
In some cases, IS tricked family members into helping the group kill.
أعمل موظف بالبلدية واشتغل خارج الدوام بمحل مال الحلويات ياخذون سلاح منا وتنظر يبيعون من عندهم ترى يعني سري هذا الشغلة فعاد قضوا واحد من الموصل اعترف على من الحمام وجوا خذوه جت الأمنية خذوني أنا ورحنا على بيته بس ما قالوا لي إنه يعني هيك شغلات قالوا أخوك عابر على الحشد يعني هيك بأسلوب قلت لهم أخوي موجود وأنا هم ما أدري يعني بأنه هذا ولا نفوت على البيت من وصلنا قاديش ثاني يوم جوا خذوا سيارته وهذا اليوم ما شفناه.
Omar's brother is thought to be dead. In other cases, the militants made sure everyone knew exactly what happened to their victims by making gruesome videos of their murders. These are the parents of a young man named Wassam.
18/5/2015 يوم الاثنين
فتش الفراش الكمدينات القناصر ما لقى قلت له لا لقى السم كرت لا لقى الجقاره هم يطر عقله من
ليش اخذوه يعني بحجه انه يعني يوصل معلومات للقوات الامنيه ويعني على اساس جاسوس. هذا الفيديو ماله الفيديو هذا من التصوير من اعدموه والله سحبته من الجماعه الناشرين كانوا حافظينه وحتى هذول الجماعه ما كل حرقون بالقفص ويا موجود هذا الفيديو جماعه القفص.
ما شفت بس شفت صورته من يسولف بس هاي شفته قبل فترة هم شفته يعني صورته ولا ما شفته ما شفته.
Ending Islamic State rule in northern Iraq was a hard-fought battle. We watched as coalition airstrikes rained down on cities, towns, and villages while Iraqi ground forces advanced, recapturing territory in a campaign that lasted more than a year. Millions of civilians fled their homes. Tens of thousands of Islamic State fighters left behind children, wives, and other relatives. They are often viewed with suspicion or hatred, and little has been done on a national level to prevent this split from becoming explosive. But Shora is different. Authorities here found the relatives of all but the most notorious militants in the camps and brought them home. Since then, there has been reconciliation, but there has also been conflict. In some families we met, anger, grief, and the prospect of retaliation are entwined.
واللي هذا أصغر مني واحد أخويا الكبير قتلوه دواعش وأخويا الأصغر منهم انتمى لهم مدة 4 أشهر 6 أشهر وانقتل وبذمته هسه عن الأطفال ما يقارب إلى 12 طفل 13 طفل
8 نساء 7 نساء تقريبا.
And not everyone who joined was a true believer, swayed by the militants' claim of representing Islamic ideals. Some were poor, enticed by money, weapons, or cars. Others just seemed to go along. But there are some whose links to Islamic State are clear-cut. This woman, Maitreya, had 4 sons and 9 sons-in-law, all of them militants, all of them killed in battle. She tells us she is overwhelmed by the anger of her neighbors.
So how does the town of Shora move forward from anger and recrimination? How much more blood must be shed before everyone is satisfied? Well, one man believed not only was it possible to end the cycle of violence, he believed it was possible for everyone to live together in peace. During the reign of Islamic State, Sheikh Jamur acted as an informal intermediary for the residents of Shora, helping the families there plead with militants to find their missing relatives. Sheikh Jamur continued in that role even after ISIS was driven out by Iraqi forces, spearheading efforts to help not just the villagers, but also the families of Islamic State militants who were left behind. Here's part 2 now of Shora, an experiment in reconciliation.
إذا بقوا ويانا ودرسوا ويانا كيفوا ويا حالتنا احنا وماكو فرق بين هذا وهذا، بين عائلة الداعشي وبين عائلتي وبين هذا، أي قلق ماكو. أما إذا ظلت العوائل بالمخيمات وتجمع عوائل النواحي كلها مخيم، فهذا يكون قلق مو بس على الناحية، وإنما يكون قلق على الحكومة، لأن هذا يصير تجمع كبير ويادي تشتغل عليهم وتعلمهم كأخذ ثار كأخذ، وما يدرسون، ما توفرهم الدراسة ولا توفرهم أي شيء يعني بالمخيمات، فيصير حقد عندهم. أما إذا تعايشوا ويانا وحالهم حالنا ما يصير ذاك أي شيء يصير، يعني هم مرتاحين. البنت تتجوز، الزوجة إذا هي بعدها.
Shora has a municipal government, but the sheikh has taken up the task of preventing reprisals and settling disputes. Among those who come to him for help is Ruqya. Her brother-in-law was a militant. Now she fears for her son, Yahya.
رحنا بالليل، قالت له خالته، قالت له الحقني على خالتنا عم رحنا، أنا مو شغلت الوجبة مالي وجبة ثانية فضل. بالنهار ما نطلع، على مود نخاف من الكلام ونخاف من أي شيء. قالت له هو إحنا طلعنا أنا وخالته لأنه لاحقنا يحيى. فتنا إحنا قعدنا شو وفات علينا وجهه أصفر وقلب راسه، وش بيكون يقول؟
جيت من الليل أمشي، فرع خالتي هو أظلم ما بيظلم، أنت وتفوت بيه طلع من دربة أبو ذاكر، بس فتت بالفرع قبل مشي ورايا وكان يقلبني إيدي، قال لي أبوك داعشي؟ قلت له لا بابا مو داعشي. كان قبل يقودني، كان يقلب ايدي لواها، قال لي اصعد بالبويسكل لا اسع ابوك طلق. كان يطلع اللثمه من جيبه وكان يحط على لثمي، اخذت اللثمه قمت اصيح عم منعام، وكان يطلع العصا من البويسكل، كان يضربني على راسي وينهزم.
قام يسولف اول نهار ما قال، بس قال ضربني على راسي ولد، يعني عبالنا هيك شغله كونه جهال بيناتهم. اللي بعدين يقول لي زلمه مو صغير الولد.
أهل البايسكلات 4-5 نشوفهم منه ونوع البايسكل، وأنا تابع الشغلة والسيد وهذا ونحقق وياهم ألا أن نعرفوا منه.
A month later, the attacker was still not found. But Ruqya and her family remained unharmed in Shora. The Sheikh's main goal is to keep the peace, and for the most part, he is succeeding. But he is also asking for accountability.
يجون المشتكي يجي ودز على المشكي عليه، ونقعد هنا نتفاهم وياهم ونحل قضيتهم كامل إلى أن يتصالحون ويروحون.
Fadl blames Matreya's family, accusing one of her sons of the murder. She is vehement in her denials.
أول ما أشتل ابني صغير وماكو مبيعة وابني صغير ما نام إذا ما أحطه يعني عندي ابني فمن شتلوا قالوا اشتلوا خالو اشتلوا خالو زهير أشو بعدين لما جدية شو تهجرنا أشو لما جينا يعني ما يعني هم يقولوا لا أنتوا ابنكم الشدار.
Matreya visits the sheikh, hoping he'll get the accusations to stop.
يعني شنو هل استقلونا هل استقلال هم ما نكروني بس
لحد الآن قالوا لي
لحد الآن يعني نوبتين هذا يقولون ترى هي مطلوبة دم قلت يا أبا باشر أشيل لي ولد وقدام الله وعباد الله خليه يذبحونه.
لا
احنا مثل ما نقول ظلينا بنات وظلينا
بس اسمح لي اني عيلة العباس ما اشتكوا على اي واحد وسعوا بعد
ما اشتكوا
بس اني اقول لك كلام
يعني
اني مطلع على الامور كلها. ابنك مشترك بالقتل هو اللي فجر العبوه وراح بس اي شكيه خوالي ما اشتكوا لان كان داعش ما حد يقدر. اني انضربت هل تشوفيني
صادق.
Matreya's about-face, an admission of her son's guilt, may help Fadl's family and further the sheikh's ambitious plan. His efforts have support among other tribal leaders in Shora and villages nearby. We followed him to a meeting that brings together victims and families of IS. The focus is not only reconciliation, but larger challenges facing them all.
ثلاث حقوق الإسلام والقربة والجيرة كل واحد على خويه ثلاث حقوق. والله ما تستوجب هالمشاحنات هذه. أنا ما أريد أتجاوز عليكم شيخ حسن. هي دورية أبو فلاح أبو عبد الله اقعدوا بيناتكم اشربوا شاي اشربوا شاي وتزاوروا بيناتكم. شنو الخلافات اللي بيناتكم على شنو؟ لا على زرع لا على شيء لا على جريه ما قح لا صحراء. الله يساعدكم شلون عايشين فيها والله. هم بيناتكم المشاكل حتى تصير العيشة ضنكة.
Rebuilding areas once held by IS has so far been slow, leaving some of the country's poorest people to fend for themselves. The sheikh believes reconstruction needs to go hand in hand with reconciliation, prosperity and coexistence, undercutting the appeal of radicalism.
السعاني أقول لك بنات ما يريدين أبوهن الداعش يعني يستحن لهم تقول داعش. فالشغلة انتهت يعني المرحلة انطوت وداعش راح يعني بس يظل محافظة الموصل يصير بها أعمار وأشغال والعالم توظف والمدينة ترجع أحسن من قبل.
It's a compelling argument. But is forgiveness too much to ask of a mother whose son's murder was filmed for propaganda?
أم الداعش وأنا سوا أم الداعش ولا خصيت داعش الابنها موجود الطيب وابني سوا لا والله ما أتحمل. يعني أنا لو بيدي مرات إلا أبو وسام أنا لقلعهم من الأرض.
إذا ابنه هو مقتول.
لا ما مقتول.
لا
طيب أنا أعرف طيب. الابن مقتول تجي الأم هذا إذا عنده ظنة ما يريد ولد ما يظل الولد ما يظل ولد.
Which is why it's all the more remarkable that her husband is able to see past their family's grief.
هنا بالقرية ما يرجع يلده. بالمنطقة أكو عوائل يعني تدري بقت الحرمة مثلا أبوها هنا زين الحرمة وين تروح غير ترد ترجع لأهلها زين إذا ويا أطفال اثنين إيش تسوي لهم؟ تعدمهم مثل الدواعش نصير مجرمين؟
ما نصير مجرمين مثلهم إحنا.
ما يصير.
And while fathers like Abu Wassam seek to avoid repeating the militants' crimes, others say the most important thing now is preventing their return to power. We are surprised to find that Zainuddin, who should have been in university, is also part of a security force organized by the sheikh. The Iraqi army has a base in Shora. but the Sheikh's guard is an added line of defense.
احنا نقطة يعني بالليل بس سيطرة على الشارع يعني الواحد ما نعرفه دواعي شي يطبون من هاي الجهة يعني قاموا يطبون من هنا كوعانه تطب من هنا عوائل دواعش تطب من هنا.
Shora is surrounded by desert, and militants still stage attacks in the nearby villages.
بيت أختي تسولف لك شو طبوا عليهم دواعش بال11:30 بالليل قتلوا ولد 2 نفذوا بين إصدار نشروا صورهم يعني تا يقولون إحنا موجودين يرعبون العالم تا يخلون العالم تبطل وهسه إحنا خاصة الشورى إحنا مهددة كثير لكن يوم بالتعليقات هددونا أنا من الناس قال انطيني عنوانك واسمك الثلاثي ذاك حتى أشوفك بالموبايلات عنوانك واسمك الثلاثي وأنا عنك طيت عنوان اسمه الثلاثي قلت له تعال جدز اسمي شنو يعني هو عنده سلاح وانا عنده سلاح اول شيء الكل انطلبت كبير وصغير اللي عنده شيء واللي ما عنده شيء الموظف والعسكري وهاي كلها انطلبت فما يخوف كلبي خلي شنو هو عنده سلاح وانا عنده سلاح خلي يجي ليش يتعنيش عرض معلش ليش تعال نقتلهم انا كيف اذا يجون كيف اذا يجي واحد ونقتله ونفتخر بهذا الشيء.
Youthful bravado, continuing attacks, poverty, and deep-seated resentment. The obstacles to peaceful coexistence are high. In other countries, truth and reconciliation commissions are a national effort, requiring time, money, and political will. One sheikh in one small town may not be able to fix this divide in Iraq, yet he and the people who look to him for leadership are trying, day by day, to carve out a pocket of calm in Shora.
One town, just one of many in that part of the world, but one still trying to come to grips with the legacy of violence. I spoke with VOA Middle East correspondent Heather Murdoch, who narrated and produced the film you just saw. She's currently on assignment in Beirut, but she was eager to talk to us about her experience, getting to know the people of Shora, the things she's learned there, and what stays with her, even now, months after the project was completed.
Well, one thing that is that definitely hits me over and over again about the families of Islamic State militants that I've met since I finished shooting this documentary in camps is the tragedy of the small children. And you can see them, the longer they stay in the camps, the more they only interact with each other, the more radical the little kids become. Like little kids, know a Westerner is an infidel and should die. And these kids have no chance, no matter, they have no chance. And I don't see how kids who grow up like this have a future. To the outsiders, they're terrorists. To insiders, they're in prison. And yeah, that's the thing that's very haunting. Little kids, actually under 5 years old, already being told that people unlike them should be killed.
Do they stand a better chance now under this experiment in reconciliation than they did before?
I think in places like Shora, where they have tried to reconcile the families, I think the kids have a lot better chance. For example, in Shora, radical ideas, people might still hold the extremist ideas in their hearts, but they're definitely not saying them publicly. And children are taught, that these extremist ideas and this, glorification of violence is wrong. And so if a kid grows up at least with those ideas introduced to them, even if they're introduced to the extremist ideas as well, at least they have a chance of growing up in a world where they can exist outside of this tiny pocket of extremism.
I imagine there are many Shoras out there in that region. Is there any effort in the region to deal with this problem of trying to stop ISIS family members from becoming further radicalized because of the hostility they may face from the villagers?
It seems like not only is there no sort of national or international effort, it seems like there's almost an effort to do the opposite. There are local efforts. The Sheikh and Shora are not the only towns trying to reconcile. However, nationally and internationally, very, very little has been done. The families of militants often live in huge camps, as I mentioned before, and when you go there, you find that month after month, people become more and more radicalized. Month after month, they become more and more extreme and more determined to restart the Islamic State and restart the jihad. And they truly do believe that everyone who doesn't believe like them should die.
Heather, was this a difficult documentary to put together?
Well, I mean, physically it was difficult because it was 50 degrees every day. We shot it over the summer. That's about 115, 120 Fahrenheit. Emotionally, it was difficult because, I mean, for starters, we just covered a war in which we were covering from behind or on the front lines with Iraqi forces and coalition forces and refugees and the people fleeing Islamic State militants. We saw a world of tragedy during that war and in the camps. So then, as the war was winding down in Iraq, starting to wrap your mind around the fact that the militants themselves were and are people and their families are often innocent. And now we know this intellectually, but really trying to get to know these families and sympathize with where they came from and not judge, that was difficult as well.
So this was an eye-opener, just watching this whole documentary about the other sides, the other side of the story that we don't often hear about. But from you, Heather, as someone who works so closely with these children, with these families, what do you hope our viewers around the world will take away after watching Shora, an experiment in reconciliation?
What I hope they will take away from it is, well, basically the idea that the Islamic State militants were people and their families that are left behind can either become another huge security threat or they can become part of this modern world again. And in some places in Iraq and Syria, the camps are neglected more and more. It's very difficult for NGOs to get aid to them because, you know, who wants to support a camp full of ISIS people? Like but that is not just a humanitarian problem, but it's also a security crisis. And I just think it's something that if we don't pay attention to this now, 10 years from now, we're going to be saying, oh, we saw this coming.
I know it may be too soon to tell, but is this experiment working so far? Has it worked?
I think on a small scale in Shora and in some other places it has worked, but I think if more is not done on a larger scale, it could be easily reversed.
Our thanks to VOA Middle East correspondent Heather Murdoch, who was part of the hardworking team of professionals who produced that documentary. They include supervising editor Elizabeth Arrett, video producer Brian Allen, our brilliant animator Brian Williamson, field producer Halan Ibrahim Shekwa, and camera operator Felipe Paiva. I do recommend that you watch this entire program on our VOA website. I'm Mil Arcega. For the time being, we are out of time. Thank you for watching.